Hello, I'd like to say a warm welcome to everyone. My name is İpek Cem Taha, and I'm the director of Columbia Global Centers Istanbul. Today, we're delighted to be presenting a timely conversation on breaking binaries, thinking about art in the COVID age, between Pakistani-born and internationally recognized artist Shahzia Sikander and Vishakha Desai, Senior Advisor for Global Affairs to the President of Columbia University. Vishakha Desai is also the President Emerita of Asia Society and serves as the Senior Advisor for Global Programs for the Solomon R. Guggenheim Foundation. Our conversation will follow from the Miniature 2.0 exhibition at the Pera Museum in Istanbul, which focuses on contemporary approaches to miniatures. The exhibition explores the theoretical potential of miniature painting and goes beyond its former context in form and content. 14 artists from different countries such as Turkey, Iran, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and Azerbaijan rethink issues including colonialism, Orientalism, migration, economic inequality, gender, politics, identity, and discrimination. This gives, these themes are represented by giving miniature painting a new dimension at a contemporary level. This current exhibit features Shahzia's work as her pioneering practice takes classical Indo-Persian miniature painting as its point of departure and challenges the strict formal topics of genre by experimenting with scale and various forms of new media. Informed by South Asian, American, feminist, and Muslim perspectives, she has developed a unique, critically charged approach to this timely honored medium, employing its continuous capacity for reinvention to interrogate ideas of language, trade, empire, and migration. Vishakha Desai is an art historian and author of the upcoming memoir, World as Family, A Journey of Multi-Rooted Belongings, Columbia University Press, February 2021. We can't wait to hear Vishakha and Shahzia as they will engage in a wide-ranging conversation about art, ideas, and notions of global belonging in the COVID age. We are honored to bring this conversation to you in partnership with Pera Museum and Columbia Centers Mumbai. Before we move on to this timely lecture, I would like to pass the word to Ravina Agrawal, the director of Columbia Centers Mumbai. Ravina?
Thank you so much, Ipek, and to the entire Columbia Global Centers Istanbul for putting this together, and welcome everybody on behalf of Columbia Global Centers Mumbai and the entire Columbia Global Centers network. We are so pleased to present this program to you. It's so timely, it's so meaningful to ask about art in the current time period. The Global Centers promote global dialogue. They promote knowledge exchange, and they promote ways of reimagining a world and solutions to the challenges that we face in partnership and in collaboration with experts in various parts of the world. And now more than ever, as the title suggests, we need to break through boundaries between rural and urban, between national and international. The COVID, now more than ever, we cannot come up with solutions in isolation, and that the earlier binaries will be thrown up, and hopefully new forms of imagining will emerge that do not replicate old inequalities, but enable us to shift away from them. Of course, that shift is not easy, and we see inequality very much part of the way in which we imagine solutions. But if we can use art and its imaginations to move away, as the miniature shows us, it's a multicultural form, it's a multi-local form, and that being an Indo-Persian form, we recognize the global in our own locals, and we recognize that we need new forms and frames to get us beyond the current period. We need artists and we need imagination. And I know no better than these two people, Shahzia Sikander, whose work I have long admired, and Vishakha Desai, the art historian, who has brought in her role as at the Asia Society and in her writings and her imagination and her collaboration with the global centers, ways to probe this. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation, as I'm sure are our audiences. Welcome, everybody.
Thank you, Ravina. Thank you, Ipek. What a pleasure it is for us to actually come together now that we are all in our own living room with all kinds of backgrounds that are present. The reality is that we can be together while we are alone in our offices. And that in itself has another kind of breaking of binary that Shahzia and I want to really talk with you about. Let me just say that Shahzia and I go back a long ways. And therefore, we have conversations that go on for hours, sometimes over lunch, over a drink, and in different parts of the world. The reality is that what we want to do today is to have a conversation in front of all of you. So it is really a conversation. And while I'm starting this, it's entirely just to get us going. And at some point, we'll say, okay, to be continued. And then we'll listen to you and get your questions and make sure that we can answer them as well. Let me also just say that the reason for this program is that when Pera Museum asked me to write an article in their exhibition, Miniature Painting 2.0, it was because of the exhibition I'd worked on with Shahzia and an Indian artist, Nilima Sheikh, whose work is also in the exhibition. And I thought that they had heard about me through our Istanbul Center. And they said, no, it was because of that particular exhibition in the wake of 9/11, when we did at the opening show, one of the opening shows of the Asia Society called Conversations with Tradition. And so it seemed apt to me when they asked me to give a lecture. I said, I don't want to do a lecture. I'd rather talk to Shahzia. And so that's what happened. And Shahzia and I, of course, have been talking about some of the issues that we hope to talk with you about as well. So Shahzia, I'm going to just start and then we'll take it from there. And that is that we talk about this age of COVID. Clearly, you were in the middle of amazing projects. COVID affected all of us, that's for sure. I thought I had just finished a book and I was just putting the finishing touches on. And then COVID happened. And I said, oh my God, I have to write a postscript. I have to write a new piece because the issues that I'm talking about in the book are completely relevant to this moment in time, which is how do we think about ourselves relationally with others? Hence the title World as Family, which obviously comes from an Indian Vedic phrase called Vasudeva Kutumbakam, very hackneyed phrase to some extent. And I had decided I was going to give up on that title because it was too abstracted. And then COVID happened and I said, oh my God, this is exactly what it's about. So I want to know for you how COVID affected you and see if we can think about that through the work, and then we'll take it from there.
Thank you, Vishakha. Thank you, everybody. I am so honored and glad to be part of this and be invited to, share some of my work, but also be in conversation with you, Vishakha. But, an opportunity to think through these things because COVID is unfolding. This whole notion of what lies ahead is not necessarily we don't understand fully. And so in that sort of moment, which is so uncertain, which is so much about this flux, which also showcases, privilege and lack of privilege, like us being in our respective spaces, but having access to the internet, having access to speak about these issues is also such a place of privilege. And so with that in mind, I think for me, I can speak only for myself. As an artist, I often work pretty much, by myself for long periods of time. And a little bit when one is making work, one is a little isolated. And when the work does sort of, exist and it starts engaging collaborative natures or steps outside of the studio or goes into a public space, at that time, it's a very different dynamic. So I was affected, and I was not necessarily that affected in the sense that I am pretty much a little bit of an introvert. So it did not change this idea of all of a sudden, what am I supposed to do? How I'm going to engage people? But definitely, I think in terms of the work itself, it has made me really think harder about issues around power, powerlessness, about women and power, about ideas around nation and state, and how where is geography going to be placed? What type of framing devices are we going to place on art? Who gets to represent what? Where is ownership? Even in terms of miniature painting, for lack of a better term, I know I've been told many times miniature painting is not the right way to talk about it. But when we are talking about, say, this particular show, which I haven't really seen, and I was sort of invited long after the show had already been put in place. So how do you determine, Vishakha, what is miniature painting? It encompasses such a long geographical, philosophical making of iconography. It's so syncretic, and it goes all the way, into Europe, and I would say all the way into China. And so how did you guys choose which artists from which part of the world were going to be represented as the miniature painters?
I think, as you mentioned, the idea of miniature painting, what is embedded in that word miniature painting, it immediately evokes, if you will, a kind of some other world of courtly life, some other world that is, quote unquote, authentic to a particular expression, predominantly, as people would think about, in the Muslim cultural worlds. I say Muslim cultural worlds because the art of the book came in terms of illustration. One doesn't say that. It's very interesting. Medieval manuscripts, you don't say miniature painting. Medieval manuscripts, people say are manuscripts. They are manuscript paintings. But because these are disembodied images that have been taken often by others to tear the books apart and sell them as individual pictures, the phrasing miniature itself comes from essentially the Western tradition of as if it's miniature of something, rather than saying they're court paintings, whatever they are. And so in the essay, I talk about it, but that in itself right there picks up the question of power of art. What is the intention? What is the reception? Who gets to call what? And the specificity, at the same time, transcendent quality of art that miniature painting still lives on. It lives on from 300 years ago to now in different ways. And yet when we say the word, it has some particular historical power references. So it gets right to the heart of what you're talking about.
But it also, I'm sure it's very different, say, for a artist in India, because I'm from Pakistan and my frame of reference and knowledge is a little bit closer to South Asia. So growing up in Pakistan, when I start engaging with miniature painting, I've talked about it a lot, but so I won't going to go into details. But, it's not like you could walk into a Met museum or you were exposed to the understanding of what the art form is, where it comes from, and what its capacity is, legibility as well, and how do we see it, not just sort of art historically, but visually in terms of an encounter with the art. So when there's no encounter with the art, which is interesting now since all of us are very much in this virtual zone, of understanding and experiencing art too. But most of my experience was looking at images in Western institutions' catalogs, exhibition catalogs. So a catalog from the British Library might be circulating, and so you saw the 20 images in there, and that was it. Whoever chose them is another frame that's happening, right? A frame of removal. So when you're actually not physically seeing the art, but then somehow you have to claim that as your art.
I know, isn't that amazing?
As your culture and as your history. Isn't that hypocritical?
I know. But you know what's so interesting about that? It's here you were in Lahore. Lahore has one of the finest collection of Pahari pictures. But because they're not Mughal, in Pakistan, what wonders, because until Ajazuddin actually published them, people didn't even recognize how many of these pictures were there. And then the book was published. And here you are sitting in Lahore, and you wouldn't have even thought about going to see those original pictures.
Yeah, because obviously, I think in 1986, 87, when I encountered miniature painting at the National College of Arts, it wasn't the way 20 years later, it became a big kind of interest in the youth. But, so at that time, the interest in miniature painting is being dictated by the climate that one is in, which is obviously it's Zia's period, it's military dictatorship. A lot more changes are occurring around. But even at that time, in terms of understanding the art form itself, was very much through Bashir Ahmed, who's there, through Zuhur al-Akhlaq, who was exploring it in a Western medium, in paintings, with tourist markets that one had a little bit of exposure to in Delhi and all. So it wasn't really that familiar in terms of its link to the past. And that elephant in the room, so to speak, like the several hundred years of colonial history and the ruptures that has caused, and the mindset that it would bring forth, where you're like, oh, it is a very derivative art form. It's not capable of an intellectual engagement. Some of these aspects are very prevalent. And I wonder, have they shifted now? Is there opportunity to engage them? Like at some level, the concept, the curatorial vision of the Pera Museum is still sort of not that different, right? It still is talking about the possibility with tradition and the avant-garde. Your conversations with tradition 20 or 25 years ago was around the same things. So much of this tension with what is modern and what is traditional continues to engage often people of color or people that are not necessarily part of the Western canon.
But that in itself is the kind of binaries that we all fall into. And the art itself, it seems to me, gives you the capacity, as you've done in your work, a number of artists in the show do, which is not so much that you are reflecting on the miniature or the tradition and then you're breaking out. You actually are doing contemporary work. And that is one of the sources that are part of you that you can use. And art has a capacity to actually do those layered perspectives. And the problem often is the reception of the art, I think. It's not so much the intention. And that is that the people are often trying to put us in boxes. This is traditional. And then if you use it, you are a contemporary traditional artist, whatever that means. Or finally, in your work, you have moved way beyond so that nobody could say in your big video installation like Parallax that it is something about you breaking that boundary of miniature, because you've broken out of that entirely. It's been a long journey. I mean, it's a 30-year journey, if you will. But people looking at it often are trying to put it into little boxes. And that, it seems to me, is also around identity questions, how people put us all into little boxes. But before we go anywhere else, I want to see what you're up to, because your new work that actually has come up from COVID and then going forward, because I know you have a show on right this minute at Sean Kelly with some amazing new work.
Yeah, so, I won't have that much time to talk, but I was going to just give a little broad few paragraphs and show some images and maybe talk about, share the new sculpture.
Right.
But I will do that. And when we come back, I do have a question.
Okay.
And I will just say that so that we don't forget, because this idea of about identity and art history, I think it's so tied with the idea of nationalism.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we need to sort of unravel that
Absolutely.
idea of which nations are more important and get included.
Right.
Okay.
Absolutely. So remember that. We'll come back. Yes.
All right. So I'm going to share the screen. All right. So my work as a visual artist investigates interdisciplinary language of forms, migratory patterns, cultural quarantine, flux of human identity. I work in a variety of mediums and scales to address the multivalence of ideas. Every work I create, I conceive of it as a poem, individually crafted, exploring tensions between material and meaning, people and society, power and powerlessness, to engage with the intrinsically beautiful and poignant into relevant and transformative. So the notion of home and authentic state is embedded within my practice as an artist, but not in any definitive ideology, nationalism, or geography. The multiple juxtapositions, unexpected detours, dissonance, jostling, shifting hierarchies are strategies I have employed in my work since a very long time, at least since the mid-90s, with the attempt to destabilize and explode binary thinking in all its form. So this non-gender binary identity is equally layered in my work, and it is particularly heightened in iconographies of women that are not tied to a heteronormative lineage or to a conventional articulation of diaspora and nation. So the idea is encapsulated in this new sculpture, which I've created. It takes its title from Gopi Gayatrinath's essay, which she's written on my work, Promiscuous Intimacies. But what I wanted to share here is that the idea has been a DNA in all my work. The female protagonists that you see have been present in the work in many ways. They are equally androgynous, proactive, confident, intelligent, and in their playful stance connected to the past in incredibly imaginative ways. That's how I see, how I engage with the past. My interest is not in glorifying it, because for me, the works that I create are really about countering the fictions of purity and authentic national culture. So in 2017, I had the opportunity to be part of the New York City Mural Advisory Commission on City Art, Monuments, and Markers. And during that process of hearing different public opinions, studying public monuments, their complicated histories, historical reckoning, and tensions between communities regarding representation, I felt that the urge was there for me that if I ever got the opportunity to engage with a sculptural work, I would address it as an anti-monument and also, as a counter to the very male histories that are represented in public spaces. So, so the sculpture, is made. I started with working with models, and then using that data and information to develop it in scale, in clay. And the sculpture, with its very sinuous entanglement of the Greco-Roman Venus and the Indian Devata Apsara, which I referenced from the Met's collection, the intertwined female bodies bear the symbolic weight of communal identities from across multiple temporal and geographical terrains. They also evoke non-heteronormative desires that are often cast as foreign and inauthentic, and instead challenge the viewer to imagine a different present and future. The sculpture, with its sort of backward glance, demands that we understand tradition, culture, identity as impure, heterogeneous, unstable, always in process, disrupting, taken for granted national, temporal, art historical boundaries. This sort of ideas and scholarship and dialogue was also happening in conversation with Gayatri Gopinath, who I, of course, by now you guys know I admire a lot. So this work is in bronze, and bronze has a long history in India, in the Indus Valley, in the Chola bronzes. So for me, doing bronze wasn't like, oh, yet again a new idea, yet again a new medium. So much of these mediums have been part of our syncretic history. So this idea of color and inserting or injecting the color into the classical was also a comment in my head, was how to engage with the classical painted statuary, which has often been polychromatic and not necessarily lily white. Color prejudice, points out the historian Sarah Bond, reveals that how we color or fail to color classical antiquity is often a result of our own cultural values. So for me, when I was connecting this idea of the patina, it was also how discussions on color in classical sculpture link them to the issue of classicism with American monuments and memorials, which are often revered as symbols of patriotism in their classicism aesthetic. So that sort of is, here you see the piece. It's in, this is an installation of the work, which is up right now at the Sean Kelly exhibition. But I'll stop here because I have other works which go back and talk about how I've reinterpreted the past to engage with contemporary social and political issues. But I think I find it more interesting that while we have this opportunity to engage Vishakha, that we should talk about things and not that I start giving a lecture about my work.
No, but I think that you already have given us so much to think about. And that is exactly why I think it's so relevant right now in this time of pandemic. You mentioned fiction of purity. You mentioned the idea of how art has both the capacity of the physical presence and the conceptual messages that conveyed through that. Art embodies all of this. It also embodies, as you said, sort of, you look at bronze and that choice of medium is important. It isn't just a thing. It has history, it has layering, it also is questioning of the layering, who gets to see it. So all in all, art can do all of that within one image, within a group of images, because I believe the very power of art is that it has a capacity to be very much a specific product of a time and place and transcend the geography and the history that it is part of. There is very little in our life other than the art that actually can do both. And why I think it's so important right now, because if you think about COVID, what has it exposed? It has exposed fissures. It has exposed incapacity of people to think collectively, to go beyond. As Ravina very rightly said, that imaginings that we need to create are more in a relational frame. And out of that liminality and relational frame, we not only learn to not demonize the global as opposition to national or as in opposition to local, but they all to be seen in some kind of conversation with one another. And out of that impurity, if you will, or the liminal space, new things emerge, which is what you were just talking about in terms of your work. So I wanted to ask you, I mean, I think that the last sculpture really fascinates me. And then we can talk a little bit about why has it become so important? Because your work and other artists in the show also, it's not about always longing. It is not always about glorifying. It is not just using the medium to create some other new contemporary relevant kind of an image. It is also about choosing that medium to actually explore many, many different things all at once. And you seem to do that really, really, really powerfully. So with the sculpture, the thing that surprised me was that both of those, the original models are stone, and you turn it into bronze. And that bronze, you could have used a bronze image, both in Apsara or a Greek, female imagery, but you didn't because you wanted to create also the scale of a different sort. So tell me, bronze itself, why did you try bronze? I mean, partly it's a historical thing, but what else?
Well, definitely. I think I have looked at so much of South Asian history of bronze. I've also thought that in my head, bronze was a very static image, a static medium or a tough medium. And in this piece, I really wanted to treat the bronze as like a drawing. So you have to see the piece in actual to really understand and see sort of the sensitivity of color and layers of patina. And that is, it can look like, it looks like clay. It can look like, it's very sensuous, and it's got the painter's touch or the painter's idea in there. Yeah. And I think that has always been one aspect in the work, is what is the transformative threshold in the medium, in the idea, in the actual urgency of making work. When you work with material that is hard to harness and it requires, kind of a struggle, then this broad theme of struggle that I wanted to encompass will kind of come through into the work.
Right.
That's how I think of material and its relationship to theme.
Oh, that's so amazing, because what you're saying in a way is that the material itself creates a transformative possibility within yourself as an artist, as a practice. And that people don't always think about that as a challenge. Although Jackson Pollock has talked about that too, in a way, that it's in the process where the medium, to quote McLuhan, medium is not just the message, but medium is definitely a part of the message and part of the process that you're talking about. So now we can come back to the identity question, and it comes back to, all this business of feeling that art has this capacity to be in multiple places, multiple locations. But when it comes to people, and people who inhabit multiple belongings, oftentimes we may feel, it's a struggle sometimes, we may feel comfortable in it, but there is something also about the reception. And what does that do? So the tension between how you might feel in your identity and how others perceive you. And I know you've gone through that too. All of us have, who inhabit this space. So you can be completely comfortable or not, complicated. Then there is also the other people.
Yeah, definitely. I think as an artist, the frameworks that exist, the institutional frameworks are very still, they are pretty rigid, and they are also operating on on like older notions of the prevalent art history discourses, which are intrinsically tied to nation. So no matter what, in my own experience over all these years, it does not matter how I position myself. I have found myself placed in exhibitions or not placed or taken out of exhibitions. Whether because I did not allow a very rigid representation that that particular exhibition or the institute wanted to put forth. So at that time as an artist, you feel incredibly upset because you're like, oh, well, why am I not in this exhibition? Especially, you know, at your former institution, the Asia Society, when they did the show Hanging Fire on Pakistani art, I remember I was like, why am I not in this show? And I was told, well, all the artists are artists that operate from Pakistan. But when the show actually opened, more than 1/3 of the artists lived in Melbourne, in Boston, you know, they lived outside. So it was a very interesting thing always in one's experience, is that these ideas of inclusion and exclusion are constantly being placed by systems. And systems are outside of the artist's production. Even representations of nation, right? When we're talking about South Asia, often we exclude Bangladesh.
Right.
Like, I'm sure miniature painting was happening in that larger territory. In the same way, we have Azerbaijan, but we don't have Armenia in the exhibition, or maybe we do, I don't know. So like, you know, these are very important things, especially now if you really want to have an honest conversation about what COVID is going to do. Right. COVID is really going to remove some of these boundaries, or we have to really rethink, then we also have to rethink outside of our own places of comfort. Right. And that's what I think always as an artist, because I want my art to embrace all of these things, because long after I'm dead, I would want that the art still has the ability to make some sense or remain meaningful. So when I think of time as a medium in the work, but time also in terms of the larger, broader engagements with the human nature.
Right.
Or, you know.
No, I mean, absolutely, because in some ways what you're saying is that when identity is seen as fixed, it creates big problems. Rather than, and anthropologists have talked about identity being constructed. It is not something that you just are simply born with, but it also has what other things you encounter. So the truth of the matter is that when there is a show that deals with Pakistan, people could say, okay, it's only people based in Pakistan. Or, for example, when we did Hanging Fire, at least I have to say that I fought to have you in the show, but the curator was not going to do anything about that. So there you go. But the reality is that when we did The Edge of Desire, the Indian show, right from the get-go, I had said, we are going to do that show only about artists based in India, specifically because of the kind of encounter between the opening of Indian economy and the 1993 riots. What these elements, which are the watershed years, really cause people to think about their practice within that locale. Because I, as a person from that place and living elsewhere, was very aware that my issues and how I look at it are somewhat different from the issues within the country. So in that sense, it was bound by the specificity. But you say that up front, right? You can't just say, do one thing and say another thing. You know, that was a problem. However, I think that the reality is that, as you said, people have a hard time to actually put you and to allow you to be in multiple places. We've talked about the fact that, you know, sometimes, at least nowadays with artists, often people would say, born in, lives in. for many writers and scholars, people don't say that. So often I get invited and people say, can I just say Indian? And I say, no. And they say, well, but you are Indian. So somehow the primacy is given to Indianness, and that's because what I look like, not to the fact that 2/3 of my life I have lived in America. And that classic story of a third generation Chinese American woman from Texas is a good friend of mine, that even third generation Chinese American in Texas could be, and she speaks English with a Texan twang. And people say, where are you from? And you say, what do you mean? Say, oh, gee, you speak English with this particular Texan accent. And she says, that's because that's where I'm from. But not allowing people to think of the belonging in a place, even if that is not what your skin color says. And partly to redefine what it means to belong in some place. And I think that the issue is, what COVID does bring up for me is that here is a disease. It lives in our body. And our body then reminds us that we're part of the universe, a human universe, even a broader universe, because it's an animal transmitted disease that's come to human beings. It goes everywhere. It knows no borders. It knows no nationalities. It does no class, only because of access. Who has access to health? However, it also reminds you that, yes, some things are going to have to be ultra local. It has to be very specific in terms of what you will do, wearing a mask, being in one place, ultra local. But it needs that local to be connected to the national and national to connect to the global. That multiplicity of layering is something that I think art can actually allow you to do. So when you look at the sculpture, wonderful, that's called
Promiscuous Intimacy.
Promiscuous Intimacy. Wow, mouthful. But it has that idea of, it feels uncomfortable to see those two elements together. And I can't wait to see it in December because I haven't seen it yet. But it's very interesting to me that it feels both uncomfortable and at the same time, it is alluring. And that idea of feeling uncomfortable when things come together and jostle. But it is also the place of creativity and alluring in the sense of something interesting is going on. You can't put your finger on it, but the very fact that it's the westernized Greco-Roman figure kind of lifting the dancer, and the dancer, Devata, is actually, it feels to me, is celestial and joyous and happy and light. And so there's something about light and weight that's interesting about the piece. All of that sculptures can do, which I think we don't think about art often in the way it can help us think about life.
Yeah, definitely. I think art and creativity they are innate to all of us. And especially right now, we need to support the arts. We need to encourage people so that it's not something that is going to be the first thing that's going to be cut on the chopping board out of our realms. And I think that's what starts to happen, especially I think performing arts in particular are really suffering.
Yeah, really suffering.
And that's another whole thing, is like what has happened is, yes, the global, national, local links that we are engaged with, like right now, talking to people in Istanbul and being in New York, and I'm sure other people at engaging us, seeing us from other spaces, but does it really actually collapse some of these problematic boundaries? Is it really generative? I don't know. I think so much the systems have to change deeply.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, I've been working a lot with young people called Youth in a Changing World. It's a big project at Columbia. And when COVID happened, we talked to about 100 of these young kids that we've been working with from around the world. And I will never forget this young man from a camp in Nairobi. And he said, I don't understand one thing, and that is that with all the science and scientific advances in the world, with all this money in big international global things, how is it that we utterly failed? Where are the systems that actually are designed to keep up with the new realities that we live in? And then somebody else said, it goes for environment too, that none of the big global systems we have, or even local, we don't connect them. So then the fissures keep being very evident. And the reality is that out of that fissures, can we actually go somewhere? So coming back to art as being essential to our life, I was reminded of the fact that Plato and in the Greek philosophy, they looked at three functions that were essential: doing, thinking, and making. And so it had to do with practical and intellectual, and making as in some reference to art making, some imagination, making things. That was pursued as a kind of an art thing. And they were seen as the three essential leg of the human endeavor. So at what point that third leg became not as essential as thinking and doing? Why is making not essential? So I've been part of another conversation, and the question is, are arts essential? And my question is that if the earlier philosophers had seen them as essential, also true in India and in a number of other philosophies, as same thing in China, where did we go wrong? Why did it become a luxury? Why did it become a kind of an option? And brain scientists tell us is that because, in fact, all kids up until the age of 13, Ramachandran talks about it in Telltale Brain, that up until year 13, kids actually relate to all parts of their brain. And this notion that creativity is lodged in one place and mathematical thing is on the other leg is not really true. What is true is the linkages around those things. After that time, it all has to do with the education system that completely fails to cultivate that side of the brain that could connect back into the intellectual or the doing part of the brain. And so there is something about why it is that arts have this possibility, but somehow because of power, possession, especially visual arts, I think there's something about money that gets involved in all this that changes how institutions and people deal with it. It's a thing to have, thing to own. That, and then it's professionalized. It's very professionalized. It's not an endeavor that everybody can do. So I wonder if you would think about what is it that has given us away from essentiality of art?
Wow, yeah, that's a these are all of these things, unfortunately, are very prevalent, right? And no matter how it does put pressure, say, for artists, that anybody who wants to be able to exist as an artist or wants to make art often will come and ask, do I need to go to a graduate program or do I need to go to an art school? No matter what the discussion entails, people do often end up going there because they think that's where things will get made. And most of the time that has been the case. But now I wonder, with no colleges, with, economies are in a free fall, what does that mean for somebody who was just in an art school right now and is right now wondering, or just graduating, where are they going to head? How are they going to make art in terms of their desire to be part of, say, the art world or something, right? So these things have made it problematic. But I don't know. These are not simple.
No, not at all.
To have either.
Right.
But what I think of in terms of, say, engaging with my 10-year-old is often that art is not about just making
Right.
a particular drawing or your ability to illustrate something very, realistically, or it is a way of thinking. It's like problem solving.
Right.
How to think of any problem that you have, if you can think of it in creative ways. What is that? That could be your math problem, it could be your science problem, but to step outside of the box and think with resilience, think with creativity. These are things that don't just naturally happen. They may be occurring, but you need guidance.
Right, absolutely.
That type of discussion, I think, can be incredibly meaningful if it's,
and especially for K-12. I mean, for high school and younger students, where thinking creatively becomes part of a way of thinking. It's not just thinking through books and through memorization and intellectual question. And that's why I think I love the fact that Einstein actually said that, yes, science is my passion, but without imagination of an artist, you would be nowhere.
Yeah. Also, I think, like, I've often told him, and think of myself too, that when you can't solve things, then you shouldn't worry. Like, you can't solve everything, and you
Right.
should let some of the solving happen through dreaming. I think it's very important for me that, so much gets where dreams play a role. So dreaming big, dreaming large, but dreaming really as it means of letting go that you can't solve. But that's one place where it helps to have that perspective when there's anxiety around the uncertainty. But I think often artists are engaged with much uncertainty, so they are trained, they can juggle it, they can make something out of it, they can use it and transform it. But it's the larger systems and structures that often fail us. And I think right there is art history. I have a beef with that art history, because art history, no matter how much you may be exploring, expanding, you still, like 20 years later, it's the same old framing systems and rhetoric.
Right. Well, once in a while you can break it. And remember when we first did the contemporary stuff at the Asia Society 30 years ago now, and people initially, there was actually an art historian, a senior scholar, who wrote in one of the major magazines saying that, why should we, trained as traditional art historians, deal with contemporary art of anything? That is not what we were trained to do. Let the Museum of Modern Art and the Whitney and others deal with that. And my rhetorical answer was that as an art historian, even if you're trained in 16th century Indian painting as I was, if I was to teach a survey class, I had to learn about things of the past, all the way to Indus Valley civilization. So why wouldn't you think that you have an obligation to look at what's going on in life now? And if we don't do it, why is it that we haven't? And that question of why is it that we haven't immediately gets you to colonialism, fissures with tradition, how people think what is pure, what is unauthentic, anything that actually comes out of a place like South Asia, India, essentially is seen as, well, it couldn't be any good. Because if it was any good, a curator in New York, a contemporary art curator, told me, what do you mean? If it's any good, I would have seen it. And I said, gee, when was the last time you went there? Never. Because the presumption was it would have come to New York. This was 30 years ago, but still. So the reality is that things sometimes take a long time to change. And once in a while, you kind of feel like you go backwards and then one step forward. two step backward, one step forward in all of these binaries that come up. But at the same time, I wanted to ask you as a question, and then we'll open it up. And that is that clearly where you are at now, or even where I feel I'm at emotionally, psychologically, is quite different from maybe where I was 30 years ago. So that process is also ever changing, right? It's not like you were always there. So just say a word about your own journey of how you are dealing with and taking art and where you are, not just artistically, but in terms of your own sense of self.
Oh, definitely. I think how I think, as I said earlier, is I think of the idea of belonging and home exists in the practice itself. It's in the work, it's in the craft, it's in the medium itself. And when I think in that way, it really allows me to, push boundaries, push myself, and do rigorous research towards the work that I'm making. That's one strategy. The other has always been how to not shy away from collaboration, and really challenges me. So when I collaborate with other artists or authors or composers or musicians or other mediums, then I have to engage with difference. We have to, the sort of the dissonance that's going to happen when multiple voices can come together is a very powerful notion for the work. But it puts you in places which are the opposite of becoming complacent. So that sort of is another strategy for me, that how I create work and how I move forward, that sort of a very broad engagement with the practice itself. And
that's changed though, right? Because at the beginning you weren't doing as much collaborative work. I remember when you first started doing the video, that initially it was very much a kind of individual, solitary, intense kind of investigation and work. So that's one of the threads of your shift. Also, the level of questioning that you do now, it seems to me, is at a far different level than it might have been 25 years ago.
Yes. So one other thing I would say, which I just thought of, is the difference is really in thinking of yourself as on the periphery or thinking of yourself as in the center. So when you start centering your work, then your concerns are not about, oh, how should I translate this work for the other? The onus and the pressure is on the other to really engage with the work at the place that it exists, which is now possible because there are more voices participating. There are more people telling their stories, not just in the art world, but in the larger collective sphere. Who gets to tell the story is really part of our history. It's like how history is framed. So usually the highest bidder will get to tell the story, right? So when you start having more voices participate, it shifts the idea of you being on the outside, and you can think of yourself as being in the center. And then I think the work starts to take on that type of demeanor and energy, I think. Yeah.
And at the same time, I think that as you describing it, that to me, the center is not so much a center in terms of power, but that you are centered. And therefore, your feeling of where you are is not outsider looking in or a diaspora looking back. It is about who you are, and that becomes a center and a comfort level from which other things explore. So as Kamala Harris said once, before she was nominated, and she said, I know, people ask me all the time, who are you? A woman, okay, that's a given. Of color, am I a Black person, Indian American, Asian American, and or an American? And she said, I tell you, I'm all of it, and you have a problem with it, you deal with it. However, it keeps coming back, right? Because it's not like something can get disappeared. And it took her a long time to actually feel comfortable with those multiplicities. So there's something about a journey of comfort level being at the center. Before we go to the question, I know that you have a wonderful piece with the Turkish connection. Do we have that?
I wasn't sure whether the sound is going to come through.
Okay. So what we'll do is we
because
can look.
I had a conversation on Zoom with the composer, with Diyan, and the sound of all the way the sound comes through, it was really difficult for people to hear.
Okay. So another time we will have to, I wanted to come back to the Istanbul center and see that you of course let no boundaries come in your way. Chinese, Turkish, whoever, absolutely interesting people. So
yes,
that's the key.
So the score is in Turkish. It's
right.
A beautiful oral song, but it has a vernacular in the region. So it's not just spoken in one language. It's the multiplicity of language. And Zeynep Bangash, who sang it was living in Turkey too, so she's multilingual. And of course, my composer, who I've been working with for over 10 years, is Chinese American. So.
There you are. Right there is the world is your family.
Absolutely.
Totally true. So with that, Merve, I think we can take questions and see where we are.
Sure. Thank you very much for this wonderful conversation. It can't be more timely than this. And I would like to remind our audience that you can post your questions on the Q&A box on YouTube. But in the meantime, maybe Shahzia, just because you mentioned about yourself being at the center and your personal journey. So Vishakha, I was reading your article on the exhibition catalog, that wonderful article where you mentioned that, you know, during your education at the National College of the Arts in Lahore, it was so interesting to me to see that, you know, you were, in your words, Vishakha, mastered the technique of courtly paintings that meticulously, as if you were like an, you know, apprentice in the Mughal court from like 2 centuries ago. So it wasn't like, you know, you were engaging with the past from that moment, that present moment, but as an artist, as a practicing artist. You've been through that hard technique by using the, you know, the Bosley paper and the brushes made out of animal hair. So can you talk about that engagement a little bit, expand on that a little bit in and of itself? How then you go beyond that? So what do we make of it? Because I think there's a difference between, you know, engaging with the past from where we are not right now, but actually trying to understand that specific moment in the past, that's to say the traditional courtly paintings, and how they try to convey a certain theme, a message, and a technique in their own right.
Yeah, it is a very, it's not a simple thing, right? It's not like you're learning tradition and tradition is something that can sit inside a box. And then here is the box, open it up, and you're gonna learn all aspects of a tradition. I think my work questions fundamentally, like, who determines what is tradition? So that has always been my occupation with it. So when I don't see, you know, say making the brushes, the act of making the brushes, that Bashir Ahmed's curriculum, there is a semester where we make the paint, we make the brushes and the Bosley paper. It's a beautiful encounter, and it teaches you how to use your hand in terms of making something. It teaches you how to make things out of an economy but with time, with patience. It taught you other things. It's not like, oh, this is how Behzad made his brushes, right? So it's like this idea of acquiring tradition is a very performative idea. And that is exciting. It's interesting, but it cannot be seen, oh, you learned a tradition and then that tradition is something tangible and static. It cannot be like just the act of making the brushes and the act of making the paper does not validate this broad idea that I am now a traditional artist or I have understood the tradition. That's a journey. And I think with due respect to Bashir Ahmed, he did teach the techniques. And those techniques have been just a minor part of many more types of techniques that exist within the genre of Indian, Persian, Turkish, Central Asian, all the way far into icon painting. Like these are techniques that have obviously changed and shifted and altered. And what one encountered them with Bashir Ahmed and for myself in 1988, 89 was definitely something that gives me a kind of a something like an armature, a structure, and to understand. It's like learning a language. So when I was like, why I'm learning that language, I'm also trying to understand the visual dimension of this art history that is outside of the Western canon. And how do you start engaging with that is hard because it's all ongoing. I still, when I go to the Met or I'll go look into the storages, even with the conversations with John Saylor, who goes to Ahmedabad and engages, creates new books every year through the archives that have not yet been published. So much of this material is invisible in that way. If it's not archived, how do we know what it is? So that idea of tradition, I think, is so impossible to put in words, right?
I think, Shahzia, it seems like it's fair to remind people that when you started doing this work at NCA with Bashir, that actually that in itself was kind of a counterintuitive process because of the colonial history of India and Pakistan, that majority of the artists working then were working in westernized, more of the oil painting tradition, and court painting was seen as a bazaar painting only, right? So you have the very act of doing that is the act of resistance rather than glorification. And then, right? I mean, and also that you're talking about having this as a tool in your toolkit. That's what people don't understand, that when it comes to something from the past, immediately it has a feeling like you can't just use it as a tool. All the other baggage that comes with that word, traditional, court painting, history, then has another political valence within the new nation context, right? So it's kind of an interesting double bind that people don't even understand, that if you were doing this, it's a solitary thing. This was not something that lots of people were doing. And it was unusual. Yeah.
It's also tied to the English, history of revival of the Indian arts and crafts, right? So so the idea of craft was inherently tied to that. Yeah. So anything too craft-based was seen as suspicious.
Right.
So here
you don't have any critical conception or a critical component in it, right? No intention, So true. This, Merve, I know there was another question that's come up.
Yes, there's one question from our audience. So how has your research strategy has changed during the pandemic when libraries and public spaces for research are closed? And how do you think future generations will reflect on these times in their art?
Very important question. I think more institutions need to digitize their collections, and not just the visual collections, the textual based collections. I think the archive is a very significant place where we can give access around the globe to a lot of students. And I think that obviously is something much has to happen at a broader, bigger scale. Like even for myself, I was trying to research and wanted some images out of the Istanbul Museum. Mm-hmm. And it's not very easy. You go on the museum site and it's not like you have digital access there. So it's not just the institutions, say, in America, for example, but there are many institutions. I would love to have access to material in many museums in India. And I cannot travel to India as a Pakistani most of the time, like definitely in these certain times, it's impossible. Getting a visa to go there has always been very, very difficult. So much of the archives there would be so critical. So how do we access those?
Mm-hmm. And also, like, now that it's interesting to see that
that's not a COVID problem.
Yeah, sorry? That's not a COVID problem. In fact, having the COVID problem then just makes it like, you're like, oh, well, we can't even travel. We can't travel, so it doesn't matter which visa. But it has been a problem. I think accessing so many things I would have wanted to access, there's very little information. You have to look into books that have been out of print and try to get a hold of those. It's something that I think will benefit the world if we make archives available easily to everybody.
And on the other hand, I mean, today's like many online platforms are bringing newly emerging works of art to audiences with some, unprecedented rapidity, if you will. So, but then there is this question of digital versus the physical encounters with art. So is this bringing us new possibilities in terms of democratizing, in a way, of like access to art? Or, and then on the other hand, there's this question of, representation. And as you mentioned in the beginning of your conversation, who's get to choose which works, to be seen or presented for whom, that kind of the audience question. So what do we make of that? Is this like bringing out like a whole new set of possibilities, those virtual encounters, but may also have certain limitations or problems? What do you think of it?
I would just say, and I'll let Vishakha answer that, but I think there is the social media and these platforms have allowed alternative ways of artists to share their work, create an audience. There are many artists that have so much more following than even an art institution. So people it's a generational thing too. The younger generation definitely has a much different ease in terms of using media, not just to create the work, but to really create a conversation around the work and the perception of the work and how that work then has a ripple effect. So I do feel that and at the same time, as an artist that works so much with detail and the surface of material, it is very hard for me to just put the work online. like I do want people to actually encounter the work in person.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I do think that I think we have to realize that social media, just like anything else, has actually a dual or multiple functions. It both has a capacity for people to share their work, using it as a catalytic force to even make a difference. But on the other hand, it also has a capacity for people to troll people. So, for example, research shows that women artists online get much more negative, vitriolic trolling than do male artists. Meaning the attacks on art and artists and people also is very, very strong. Mm-hmm. So we need to make sure that we understand that there's some capacity that's open, that's capacious, and then some capacity that just brings it narrower and narrower because it says something that somebody doesn't like and they feel emboldened to do whatever they want. So you do have to think about, and that's true of the institutions too, but it's also true of the social media. And that reception of the work and who receives it, once Shahzia does a work and it goes out there, how people see it, she can't control it. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense, Shahzia?
Yeah.
All right, so we have another question coming up.
So an opinion claims what we lived through the current pandemic is a fast forward yet light demonstration of climate crisis. What's your perspective on relation of art with climate crisis?
Shahzia, you want to go and answer something?
I think for me, a lot of this new body of work, which I have made over the last years, the drawings, large-scale drawings and all the small works and the new animation reckoning, there is a engagement, a bodily engagement with the theme, which is, the assault on the living planet. So there is it was unavoidable when I was thinking what type of what I wanted to imagine or anchor the exhibition with. The first ideas were about extraction, the paradox of extraction and abundance. So extraction that is really extractive in nature, which is aided by corporate, global, transnational corporations, whether it is oils and rigs and fracking and climate-based extractive aspects. What are those symbols of extraction, and how can I counter that with the notion of abundance? And art, literature, poetry, the arts offer imagination and abundance. So in a broad way, it is sort of the thread in the exhibition and in the new works is this paradox of extraction and abundance.
I mean, I think about the climate crisis, COVID or whatever. There was a program at the Wallach Art Gallery at Columbia. And then the question was, can art make a difference? Mm-hmm. And what a number of people came to the conclusion, and I think to some extent I agree, is that art is about creatively thinking and putting out there the possibility. It is not so instrumentalized that it can actually solve a particular problem, but it can make visible and it can make evident the possibilities of understanding the problem and possibilities of changing the dynamic. And therefore, if you think about it, almost all protest movements have always had something visual, something musical, something theatrical, because it actually promotes that idea of thinking through all your senses. And that is what the art does. So it's not so much that what can art do for climate crisis? It is actually, how does art actually place itself in the conversation about climate, about COVID, about social injustices, about whatever. It's not so much that it illustrates the issue. It's not so much that it provides a solution to the issue, but it is catalytic in opening our mind up to the possibilities and to feel it differently. You know, I can give you an example. When we did the politics of visual arts in Istanbul, and then we did another workshop recently on Zoom. And I had an artist on the panel, African-American artist, right after the Breonna Taylor case was thrown out of the case, of the court. And rather than speaking at the beginning, she immediately created a video about that case and how she was feeling. And it was so powerful, so moving, that other people just literally felt like they couldn't say anything because it was just right there. And it was that powerful in terms of understanding something. And so that's what the art has the capacity to do. And sometimes we try to make art into all kinds of problem solving. Okay, it can do some things, but let's not put this burden on art that actually art can do many other things, not so much solving a problem per se.
So we have another question about some advice for artists who are making work right now. The question says, because we know that artists are, they're alienated, and many artists cannot even go to their studios to practice, and then there are limitations on funding. So there are many other sides of it, but what advice do you have for artists at
Well, it is a very difficult situation. I think how I often think when I'm talking with some of my younger students and artists that reach out to, especially now, is that you have to create your own community. I think a collective space is really important. So even though physically you cannot go and meet people, or you cannot go to your particular studio, but even if you're engaging more and more online and finding ways of communication through this virtual space, it's similar in the way that you will establish your own group, your sense of community. I think in that collective space, ideas come about, problems get solved, and you have more power than just as one person. So that's one thing that I think artists need to think, even though it might be harder for certain personalities. It is very critical to really step outside of that comfort zone and start to support each other and think in terms of a much more collective space through which you might be able to raise more money and find ways of sharing the space, find ways of exhibiting the work in a collaborative manner, collectively. That's one thing that comes to my mind. I can't hear you, Vishakha.
I muted myself. No, I was just going to say that I think that oftentimes, especially in the kind of what I would call modernist to contemporary period of the last 200 years, the focus has been so much on the individual at the center, individual at the center of creativity and the intentionality and all the power and the kind of the avant-garde. The notion of collective and collaborative, people do that, but we have not always privileged it the same way. And I think the time has come to actually say that the individual and the collaborative coming together can actually be a win-win. And that possibility opens up new vistas. It's sort of what Yo-Yo Ma said with the Silk Road Ensemble, that by bringing these amazing musicians together and then creating new work, again, it was so much more powerful because it had that collective idea of moving forward. And I think that I personally feel the time has come for us to also privilege the collective in conversation with the individual.
Another question that we have is, how are you depicting your thoughts in time of COVID-19 era, especially the changing social relationships? I presume it's about, how the changing in social relationships affects your work. And so you mentioned a little bit about this at the beginning of our conversation, but maybe expand on that a little bit more. Shahzia?
Repeat it. I didn't really understand the question.
It's about how changing social relationships, social encounters during COVID-19 affect you and your works.
Oh, I think in the making of the work or the reception of the work?
Yeah, in the making.
In the making, it hasn't really affected that much yet, because I was able to use in the early couple of 2 months since March, April, maybe May, I was perhaps, just like everybody else, trying to understand what was going on and unable to really create. But then I think after a while, I just sort of focused and had to make work, had to really understand what was going on. So all of that fed into the work, and it became a productive period of sorts, but with a lot of effort. But in terms of, I had an exhibition scheduled in May, which was postponed, and then to exhibit now in the summer, I was upset that why do an exhibition now? Who's going to come and see it? But then I was like, well, we really don't know if the COVID's going to end, when it's going to end. And it made more sense for me to just sort of go with the flow and, make the work. And then we'll see. So it's step by step. So right now the show is up, but very few people will actually get to see it. So it is a shifting, changing dynamic from a very personal perspective.
I think we're coming to the.
And Vishakha, you also mentioned in the beginning of our conversation that when your book was about to come out, and then came the COVID crisis. So can you reflect a little bit on that as well?
Sure. The book is kind of very personal, and so I would say it's memoir-ish. It's not just sort of a memoir. But the whole purpose of the book is to really trying to understand, how did I come to be so passionate about being in the world and kind of having a belonging that is larger than just a family or a nation or a local. And so it was really trying to get at that question was what drove me to write this book. And then I'd come up with the title because I was just so amazed that this phrase that only the magnanimous ones treat the world as family. It is the limited people of limited mind that treat the blood relatives as family, is the first line. And the magnanimous ones treat the world as family. And it's written in the front hall of the parliament. It's a very famous phrase. And it's become, as I said, hackneyed phrase. I was trying to understand, what does that really mean? And then I wrote the book. I sort of was thinking, and I talked to a number of different people, especially younger colleagues, and said, it seems too broad, too abstracted. It doesn't really say something. And then COVID happens. And I just realized that actually I had paid less attention to the word family and more attention to the word world, what is family? What do we learn in a family? And for me, family, and I come from a big family of 7 kids, and we have lots of other people who lived with us and so forth and so on in India. Family is about learning to let go, that the unit matters as much as who you are as an individual. And within that unit, sometimes you have to let go of the personal for the good of the collective. And out of that, I realized that actually it also says, if it's a functional family, I should say, is that there is something about having a comfort that you are part of something bigger than yourself, that you can always count on it. It is those ideas that become much more important in the time of COVID. And that is that you can't solve that problem all by yourself. You can't actually say, I'm just going to take care of my body because the COVID that exists in my body, if I'm infected, is the same COVID with some variation in Italy or India or China or whatever. The second thing is that I can do something good for myself, but I must think of the others in relation to it. Hence the mask. Mask is as much to protect yourself as protecting others from you. That all of those ideas really became so vivid for me that I had to write something about that, to say that this is not abstracted. It's not some generalized, ideal, abstracted notion. It needs to be put in practice, and it needs to be put in practice now, because whether it's climate, whether it's COVID, if we don't deal with it, we are going to be doomed as the species on this earth, the earth that we call home. And so we have to think of that in very human, emotional, and urgent ways. And so that's kind of how the book ended up being with, that I became even more strongly an advocate of the idea of the family or the world as family.
Mm-hmm.
Shahzia read parts of it so that she's smiling, right?
I think it's very beautiful. I can't wait for it to enter the world.
Yes, same here. Same here.
Thank you. I think, yes, Merve?
Yes.
I think there are no more questions for now, but we would like to thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. It's been great to hear more about your work, Shahzia, and the exhibition and art in the COVID age, the new possibilities and the new as a new language to create and think creatively. And thank you very much for such an engaging conversation.
Thank you. It was a great pleasure to be part of this. And Shahzia, looking forward to seeing you.
Yes, same here. Thank you so much for inviting me and for this wonderful hour and a half of conversation.
Terrific.
Thank you.
Thank you.